just one little correction. I'm not anymore affiliated with Cambridge, but the University of Oulu in Finland. So that's sorted out. So today my title is Group Identities During the Hellenistic Times, Network Analysis, Tomb Architecture and Epigraphy. And as already mentioned, my presentation is based on my project at Stockholm, Changing Group Identities in Multicultural Pre- and Post-Colonial Central Italy, Landscape, People and Materiality from about 800 to 100 BC, which was generously funded by Vetenskapsrådet in Sweden. And this first slide represents my research area, which was more or less defined by the extent of the Latin colonies in central Italy up to the start of the Punic Wars in late 3rd century BC. And thus, my research area consisted of Latium, Etruria, Umbria, Picenum, and the tribal areas in the Adriatic coast, but also Samnium and Campania, as my Italian colleagues have pointed out, actually belong to the southern Italy in Italian archaeology. But since I haven't come up with a better known name than Central Italy, so I'm talking about Central Italy, including these areas as well. And chronologically, I'm in my research, I'm moving from early Iron Age to the Hellenistic period. And today we are talking mostly about Hellenistic period, although I make a reference to the earlier periods before that. And why do I talk about Hellenistic period and not Hellenistic period and Middle Republic and late Republic? Well, that's partly because I'm talking mostly about funerary archaeology. And I think for that, Hellenistic period is a better nomination, as I will show you later. And it's also because the dating of Middle Republic, it depends on the extension of Roman domination in central Italy. So it starts at different points in different areas. So it's easier to talk about Hellenistic period. And since this is the theoretical Roman archaeology group, I'm also referring to my theoretical framework, which is social identity theory, which has been to some extent overlooked in archaeology, although Wiesner was using it in her pottery studies in 1980s. And Campbell was carrying out research in late Iron Age in Britain using social identity theory, which was defined by Teufel and Turner at the turn of the 1970s and 1980s. And basically their theory is about how identities are formed. And they are formed through a 3-stage process, which is consisting of social categorization, social identification, and social comparison. So I normally explain that social categorization means when you realize that I'm different from the others, and there are different groups. And social identification relates to the realization that I belong to a certain definite group. And then social comparison is a wider category where you are looking at the world and realizing that there are different groups and you are a member in one of them. And in my research, I'm looking for categories, identifiers, and comparisons, and doing this through tomb architecture and inscriptions, because that's enough for research material, to be honest. And why I like social identity theory is that it lines very well with the research process. So social categorization is basically the conceptualization phase of your research, when you try to define what categories existed in the past. Social identification aligns with the analysis when you are looking, for example, presence and absence of potential categories that were important in the past. And then social comparison is the presentation or comparison phase, when you move from the local level to the regional level and look at the different phenomena across a wider area. And I have always used GIS and computerized methods in my research. And today I'm talking also about network analysis, which I have used in my research. And when you talk about network research, you are normally in archaeology talking about two different things. You are talking about agent network theory. Basically is a theory which recognizes, so with material culture, and that the non-humans have also agency, if it may be only the reflected agency of the humans, but they do have agency nevertheless. Whereas social network analysis is a mathematical graph theory used to analyze relationships in networks. And already Knappett, in his groundbreaking book in 2011, stated that both ANT and SNA, network thinking and network analysis respectively, provide means for thinking about social space and understanding human networks. And when one looks at agent network theory's most influential work, Latour's 2005 Reassembling the Social, it becomes clear that these two types of network research actually complement each other. Because in his book, Latour is very pragmatic, and he urges his followers to follow the actors. That means following the evidence. And he takes ontological stance that agencies exist and they can be studied. So it's very real and realistic what he's doing. And he also emphasizes the empirism, how scholars have to know the facts. And he also believes that the research is situated so that the current theoretical tendencies also affect the research. And since he was researching technology, he was also underlying the importance of infrastructure and technology in research. Therefore, when we analyze Latour, it becomes clear that from his theoretical point of reference, it is possible to use scientific methods and technologies in order to understand the networks. And his stance is that technology and methods make following social ties easier. That means that the kind of controversy between those who follow Latour and agent network theory and those who are scientists and carry out social network analysis, they are not actually making a real fight. It's quite superficial, and these stances can be brought together in one actual research. And thus, I have taken also influences from the agent network theory and those researchers who have been influenced by its principles. And one of them have been Astrid van Ooyen, who in her 2014 article advocated ANT, and who in 2016 was studying terracotta terrasigillata pottery from Gaul using the network concepts. And she also applied chaîne opératoire in her pottery studies. She eventually tried to characterize pottery manufacture and circulation sequences and was defining different constellations. In Latour's thinking, everything in networks always happens to the constellations and nothing can happen outside them. So defining constellations is quite crucial for understanding networks. And since Van Ooyen was talking pottery as a product, I was also taking the stance that we can think tombs as products, and especially chamber tombs. And one can look at the manufacture and circulation sequences of tombs. And I return to this at the end of my presentation. But before that, I talk about Van Ooyen's constellations. She was defining the pre-sigillata pottery manufacturing sequences, terrasigillata pottery sequences, and later Rainisware sequences. And she called the pre-sigillata pottery constellation fluid constellation, because the pottery makers were copying different Roman finewares, but they were doing all production locally in the same production units. So it was copying and modeling from outside origins, but doing it all in-house. Whereas terrasigillata production was a categorical constellation, which was internally homogeneous with its own production lines, and pottery shops in Gaul, whereas later Rhenish wares were a rooted constellation based on local knowledge and personalized for local consumptions, and existing relations such as trade connections affected these rooted constellations, and I come back to this at the end of the presentation more. Talking about social identities and cultural markers, and I have been applying previously the idea of mental distance to these studies. Mental distance is a relative distance or closeness between cultures, and I have looked tomb architecture and inscriptions in my research from this point of view. And mental distance is originally originating from economics, and I haven't done agent-based modeling, but I find this concept very fitting for my studies, because it in economics they have recognized that when you have a cultural boundaries, the strength of contacts depends on individuals' attachments to their local groups, and these groups' connections across the boundary. And when the two groups have positive connection, the innovations are passed more easily, and this is very important in marketing, but it can be also applied in archaeology. So when we look at similarities and differences between a neighboring area, we can also look at the real and mental distances between cultures and different ethnic groups. And I have already applied these mental distance in my research in an article on I-15, when I wasn't doing network analysis or a very fancy GIS analysis contacts across the Tiber during the archive period. And what I recognized was that in the northern Latium, you had connection towards Sabine area and the Capenates and Faliscan area, where you had chamber tombs, very similar chamber tombs with niches. Excuse me? And then in the central area, you have a connection between Rome and Veii. And on the coastal area, you have a connection of chamber tomb types and the existence of tumuli. So you can see close across according to the nearer neighbors and kind of closeness to those neighbors. But before I go to the Italy, I just remind you of the natural landscape in the central Italy, because the Italy is divided into two by the Apennines, and you have different geographies on the Tyrrhenian side and on the Adriatic side, and these sides are connected to each other by mountain passes. So you can, and then you have different important river valleys that have connected different regions to each other and different areas within the regions. So geographically, the contacts have been channeled through certain passes and certain routes, so that the connections are not random, so to speak. But when I move to talk about networks, I also talk about distributions, because networks are type of distributions, and you have different kinds of distributions and networks, and these are partly assessed using social network analysis. And the different distributions include centralized, as shown in here A, where everything goes through a central node. And then you have decentralized model, which you can call also hierarchical, where you have regional nodes that are connected to lesser places and then connected potentially to a central place. Then a distributed distribution, which is kind of decentralized model. Then you have random distributions, which is always the nil hypothesis in network studies, and regular lattice, where you have the sites at regular intervals. And then the small world networks, which are often talked about in archaeology, which is basically a regular lattice with, or kind of the network with shortcuts, where this is considered the most usual network in ancient Mediterranean. And then you have the scale-free network, which is like which is different from the lattice, that it has so-called nodes, which have more connections than normal points. And internet is one example of scale-free network, where you have some active tweeters or other persons who are followed by others. For orientalizing and archaic trends, the analysis for the Iron Age, but I don't. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. I hope that the hiatus was long. Well, anyway, I use these GIS networks in looking at the distributions at local level, and the trench network is quite interesting because it shows two different areas, the eastern area, the western area and the eastern area, and these are partly cultural because in east you have the chamber tombs coming quite normative during this period, but you have still the earlier trench tombs appearing in different cemetery areas. And then in the east, the trench tomb is the dominant feature anyway. And then you can look at the local networks, like in Rome, you have the local smaller centers and more hierarchical network forming, and also elsewhere in Western area. So I have defined these different areas so that in Western area there was decentralized hierarchical network, whereas in the Eastern area there was more distributed network. And then just show you this, which is a matrix, which shows how I connect the different centers to each other in network analysis. So one center, Vicentio, has a figure 14, and that 14 means that there are 14 different tomb types in the Vicentio. And the next place, Boschetto, it shares with Vicentio 1 and Caire 1 and so forth. And there are some places without connection and some places with more connection. So that's how the matrix works. And then I use software to create these network graphs, and these graphs look different depending which program you use, and I quite like this one, which is blue and is done with NetDraw because it's clear and its colorings are also friendly to those who have problems with their color recognition. And why I like to do social network analysis is that with social network analysis, you can measure different characteristics networks have. And one of these very useful characteristics is betweenness, which measures the importance of a place in the network and how many times in the network the innovations or ideas or connections have to go through that one center. So it basically measures how central the place is. And again, I have the orientalizing and archaic trench tombs before the Hellenistic period in order to show the change in networks in central Italy. And in those times, Tarquinia was the most central place according to this betweenness measure, and Rome was after it. And then you have Ponte Cagnano, which is in Campania, and Fulci in Tarquinia, in Etruria as well, and Novilara in Picenum, and Tadinum in Umbria. So you see that there were these regional centers which were important nodes in those networks. And when we come later in time, when chamber tombs were dominant type of tomb type, this network starts to break up, and suddenly you have places like Plera and Tococasauria and Corfinum as central places in this network. And that reflects partly the fact that we don't know much about chamber tombs in Rome, because the cemetery area of Rome was destroyed in the building activities of the late 19th century. So this is these are real results, but they are anomalous because we can't recognize the true importance of Rome. And when we come to the Hellenistic period, Rome re-enters in importance, the network analysis, but you have places like Musarna and Ferentium in Etruria, which are important in these networks. And basically, I had first kind of the presentations of geographical real geographical locations of these places. So this is the Orientalizing and Archaic trench network, and you have Tarquinia and Ponte Cagnano and Rome as central places. And then when we come to the chamber tombs, the Plera over here is central, and many of the other places being quite minor in importance. Basically the network breaking down. And when we come to the Hellenistic time, the Rome is back. And also, but there is many important places in Etruria which are important in the network, and also because of their tomb types. And this is basically the image of Hellenistic local types which are distributed in different centers. And you have is relevant during this type are different Hellenized items, different columns and porticos. But here in the little Faliscan area, you have three local types: Scorpiano type, Civita Castellana type, and Faleri type, which clearly belong to the same type, the same overall class. but which are as you have this portico above the actual chamber. Whereas at Civita Castellana, the portico and the chamber are at the same level. And the same is true at Faleri or Faleri Novi, as most archaeologists know it. And Hellenistic influences and local types are also visible elsewhere, like at Sovana, where you have the famous Hildebranda tomb with its temple above the burial chamber, and the quite recently found Demoni Alati tomb, which also shows both Hellenized and Etruscan characteristics. And when we go to the east, we have also the kind of Hellenized influences there. In Fossa, which is one of the best known cemetery areas in the Adriatic area, there is a change from the trench tombs to constructed chambers.
Chambers, ihminen, herra Jumala.
Excuse me? And the Hellenized burial funerary beds, which are a symbol of this change in the area. And during the Hellenistic times, you still have trench tombs, but they are slightly problematic because the numbers are very different. And in some places, the low numbers are real, and in some places, the high numbers are real. So that's one of the problems of network analysis, to actually take the quantification into account. You are looking at the relations between different places, not so much the actual numbers behind these relations. And another problem is that when you come from the Hellenistic times to the late Republican period, is that we have a wide knowledge of so-called general Roman tombs, but they are quite often difficult to date. But there are some, so the analysis is still possible. And the late Republican network looks very different from the previous networks, and this is partly down to the number of the lower number of sites in this network. But you can see that they are connected across the different regions, with Rome quite central in the network. And when we look at the betweenness figure, we have Cumae, Faleri Novi, and Rome as the places which have a kind of strong influence to this network. And just showing you how these places are related in the real geographical space, and how you have these three important centers, Cumae, Rome, and Falerii Novi, which are important in this late Republican network. And with the social network analysis, you can measure also other characteristics of the networks. Here I have compared average distance, average degree, and so-called small worldness between different networks. And you can see that the earlier networks, before the late Republican network, after the social war, basically, they have more common between each other than with the late Republican network. And this is basically down to the fact that all the earlier networks, they are small world networks where the regions are still important, and you have regional centers as nodes in the overall network, whereas in late Republican network, that is so-called scale-free network, where Rome is the definite center. And this is the basic difference between the funerary networks in central Italy before the Roman dominance and after that. But it looks like most of the Hellenistic period, there was no kind of total cultural dominance of Rome, but the local identities were more important than general Roman culture. And then I go back to the constellations, because I was, during my research, I was trying to figure out what kind of the production process the chamber tombs would go through. And I started with archaic chamber tombs, which I took as a fluid constellations, because you were different influences coming from the nearby areas. Whereas Hellenistic tomb tradition was rooted, the network broke down, and there were lots of local types and personalized choices and different relations. And then there were also a from chamber tombs, which I didn't present to you because of keeping this presentation short. But basically the previous chamber tomb types were adapted so that they could fit more people inside them. But then you have Roman monuments and tomb types which came in with the late Republican time. And you can talk about categorical constellation when tombs were internally homogeneous, their own, you can call it production line, because the monuments were very similar, same kind of barrel types and tower. To the last thing in my presentation. I talk a little bit about inscriptions. I just remind you the central Italy that it was much earlier than Hellenistic period, and actually Rome was not among the places where you have the oldest writing, but you have early occurrences of writing in southern Etruria and also in other centers in especially Gabi in Latium Vetus. And here just showing the places with the earliest inscriptions in the 7th century BC and the numbers behind them. But mainly I want to look at the change in numbers of Italic and Faliscan inscriptions from the 5th century BC to the 4th century, then to the 3rd century, and the 2nd century, which seems to be a golden period of Italic inscriptions with many local centers such as Pietrapondante and Pompeii in Campania. And this is very different from the image of kind of losing your cultural identity in this area because of the Roman dominance. And then, of course, during the 1st century, you have the declining numbers after the social war. You can see here the Crawford's corpus. It has a tendency to date things to 100 BC, and you see that most of the Italic inscriptions, they are from this period, and one should go back and check every single inscription from the point of view of social war, how the dating was confirmed, because if it had to do with the social war, then you have a circular argument for the disappearance of the languages. But anyway, the local languages did disappear after the social war. That's the reality. And I have also used social network analysis in the case of inscriptions to do a network of languages in the Faliscan area, which I deemed appropriate location for such an analysis, because there you have contemporary places with different languages and multilinguistic situation during the same chronological horizon. And this is the Faliscan network, and this is the late Faliscan network after the Falerii Novi had been founded. So you see the difference in the network, the kind of the diminution of the number of sites and the difference in relations between the sites. And when we look at the betweenness again, we can see that during the Faliscan period, Falerii Veteres was the major center that was defining the network, whereas when we come to the late Republican period, we see the Falerii Novi being the most important node in the network, and Romans dominating this multilingual and multicultural network. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope I have shown you how ancient network theory and social network analysis can be used in the same analysis and same research process as theory and method, and how ancient network theory is basically an evidence-based but situated pragmatic theory that allows different methods, and the kind of controversy between the methods is partly made up feature. And in central Italy, there were the decentralized trench work networks during the Orientalizing and Archaic periods, which were followed by small world networks, which were replaced by the scale-free late Roman Republican funerary network after the Social War. And the same development was also visible in the inscriptions. And when we look at the tomb constellations, you can see the same change as in pottery networks, from fluid constellations to rooted and finally categorical constellations. And I want to thank you, of course, my funding body, Vetenskapsrådet, but also all my colleagues at the Department of Archaeology and Classical Studies at Stockholm, and especially the Swedish Institute in Rome, where I could spend many summers with the permission of then director Christian Göransson. And among many colleagues who have helped me in the course of this study, I want to name Francesca Fulminante and Tom Brugmans, who gave me tips in the network analysis. And naturally, I want to thank the track webinar organizers who allowed me to talk today. I hope you kind of found some inspiration from my talk. Thank you very much.